Another factor leading to increased labor force participation among females since World War II is the rising household productivity. We learned in the Becker model that the household is, in essence, its own little firm. Household time and consumption time go into this household firm to produce these utility-yielding commodities. But this little firm has become more efficient, and there isn't as much of an allocation of time necessary as there used to be. We have microwaves, we have washer and dryers, we have dishwashers, vacuums. A lot of these household technological devices came about after the war. In fact, some would say it was the ramping up for the war that increased our manufacturing sector and not only spit out tanks and guns, but inevitably those same factories were spitting out these technological advancements for the household. So that freed up time for women, who were the primary homemakers, to enter the labor force. Another way of putting it is their indifference curves became flatter, and they started to prefer working over being at home. Another force is declining birth rates. Higher real wages have increased the opportunity cost of having a child. So this real wage growth that has driven women into the labor force has also likely caused a lot of women to have less children. So they've substituted away from staying home towards the labor market. I recently saw a statistic from the USDA that said it costs about $150,000 to raise a child. Interestingly, though, that number includes things like food and shelter and other necessities all the way up to age 18. It doesn't include college education, but more importantly, it doesn't include foregone wages of the parents. Clearly, parents have to give up time in the labor market in order to raise a child, unless their wage is so high that they can afford a full-time nanny like some celebrities do. So if you were to consider that $150,000 and the foregone wages, it goes up a lot. The cost of raising a child could easily get into the $250,000, $300,000, even $500,000 mark for a typical family. And as wages have went up for women, that opportunity cost has only grown, causing less child rearing in the typical household. Another factor was the advent of the pill. This came in 1960 and gave women control over their child rearing decisions. Expanding job accessibility, the availability of part-time work and job opportunities in female-dominated professions has led women to go into the workforce at a greater pace. Part-time work was particularly important for women. Historically, part-time work would not have been common. It would have been a full-time job or no job. And this worked well for men, but it didn't work so well for women because, again, women were more likely to have children and be the primary caretakers in the household for children. So when part-time work came around, it allowed for women to stay connected to the labor force, participate more, and still raise a family. Stagnant growth in husbands' wages. To the extent males in the household saw either little growth or even job losses, women may have picked up the slack. This greater connection to the labor force, these greater opportunities for women, allowed them to become an alternative for the husband's income and led to, in many ways, even a protective kind of participation, where if the husband is in an industry that has maybe volatile employment opportunities, an example of this might be anything that is related to nature, farming or extraction industries, construction, where you might have periods of high employment and other periods of low employment. A lot of that led to women getting jobs and staying connected so that they could pick up the slack during those down periods for the men in the household. Okay, so at this point you hopefully have a good understanding of the gender changes that occurred after World War II in labor force participation. not only across men and women, but across the various age groups and the, kind of larger scale changes that have occurred and continue to occur today. The next thing we're going to do is move on to an analysis of the business cycle and labor force participation. The business cycle is that boom-bust cycle, the expansions and contractions in the economy. It's something that we always have to deal with. We don't want to, but we have to. It's part of our economy. There's two effects on labor force participation from the business cycle. There's an added worker and a discouraged worker. The added worker effect says that when you have a recession, for example, the primary earner in the household loses their job, and that causes other household members to look for a job. So within the labor force, you still have the household member that lost their job participating, because remember, to be a labor force participant, you are either working or actively looking for work. So they're still in the labor force. But then you start to get the spouse that comes in and looks for a job. Maybe some of the kids jump in and start to look for a job. So labor force participation tends to go up during recessions. In our model, this is a non-wage income effect because the other household members, they're seeing their non-wage income decrease as that primary earner loses their job. The discouraged worker effect is another one. This is where a person stops looking for work because they're pessimistic about the job market. This causes a decrease in labor force participation during recessions. It makes sense that it would, because in a recession, people that are not working but looking for work can get discouraged easily. They're going out and applying for jobs and they're getting rejection after rejection after rejection. They're watching maybe family members and friends and colleagues out there not able to get jobs and losing jobs. So this can cause them to stop looking. When they stop looking for work, they leave the labor force. In our model, this is a substitution effect. They're perceiving lower wages, and as a result, the opportunity cost of leisure goes down, so they're willing to take more leisure. Notice that these effects work in opposite directions. The added worker effect of a recession causes labor force to increase, whereas the discouraged worker effect causes labor force to decrease. So in a recession, what effect dominates? That is, what is the net effect? Well, evidence suggests that the discouraged worker is more potent than the added worker, meaning that when we go into a recession, we're likely to see a greater decrease in labor force than increase. Hence, the labor force participation is pro-cyclical. When the economy goes down, recession, the labor force participation goes down. Why is this? Well, the added worker effect only impacts households where a primary earner becomes unemployed. But the discouraged worker effect impacts all households. If you think of all the workers out there, the ones that are in households that have a primary earner is a smaller subset than the entire worker pool available. So what happens is the incentive for people to rush out and add to the labor force because, dad or mom lost their job, that's not as strong as the incentive to leave the labor force because you don't feel like there's any opportunities available to you. The result, labor force participation decreases during a recession. Now, the way we illustrated this here is we were looking at a recession, but we can reverse everything during an expansion, which means labor force participation would increase. And in this case, you get what's called an encouraged worker effect that's greater than a subtracted worker effect. Think about it. During an expansion, the primary earner gets their job. So the other household members actually leave the labor force during an expansion. There's your subtracted worker effect. And as far as being discouraged, well, people are no longer discouraged during an expansion. Jobs become more abundant. Companies are hiring. Friends and colleagues and so forth are employed. So you get an encouraged worker effect. Okay? Same pattern, though. This dominates this in both cases, and therefore we get the encouraged worker effect dominating the subtracted worker effect, and again, a pro-cyclical effect. When the economy goes up, labor force participation goes up. Finally, let's talk about weekly hours of work. In this illustration here, we have a timeline showing the average work week. Note that prior to the Great Depression, you see a drop in the average work week. That was likely due to rising real wages in the early 1900s, in particular the Roaring '20s. This is true if the income effect does dominate the substitution effect. Then you get the Great Depression and you get World War II. It's very hard to analyze what caused the various change in work week during that period because of so many economic and political variables occurring at the same time. But after World War II, we went back to normalcy and real wages grew, so we should have seen the same kind of decrease in the work week that we saw in the early part of the 1900s. But we don't. In fact, after World War II, the weekly work week pretty much stabilizes at 40 hours. So why would this occur? One explanation is firm resistance. This idea that firms have fixed costs and variable costs when they employ labor. The variable costs are obvious. It's the wage. But the fixed costs, not so obvious. When you hire a worker, you've got to train them, and that's going to be a fixed expense no matter how much they work, and fringe benefits. Healthcare plans, pension plans, those are fixed costs regardless of how much the worker works. So as an employer, if you're going to have these fixed training and fringe benefits, you would rather have the worker working more than less. Then there's the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. This was a federal labor law that said employers must pay overtime, essentially 50% more of the wage, if they employ a worker over 40 hours. So this led to employers standardizing the work week at 40 hours. Not 38, not 35, not 30, and certainly not 41 or 50 because of the premium. So 40 hours became the logical target for the work week. Another factor that likely prevented the work week from declining is higher marginal tax rates. Higher tax rates continued from the post-World War II era all the way up until the mid-'80s when they came down a bit. But these higher marginal tax rates meant that workers saw really decreasing take-home pay. And when the pay went down, to the extent we have an income effect that dominates the substitution effect, that incentivized workers to work more and kept that decrease in the average work week from continuing. And lastly, higher educational attainment. You can see here that from the post-World War II era to the present, we see increasing college degree attainment. This has likely increased the average work week, or kept it from going down, I should say, because education leads to a preference for intrinsically pleasing and safer careers. In other words, people were not going to work as in, say, 1900 just to get the pay, just to do a job. They were going to work to get the pay, but also do something they love to do something they spent years training to do something that may even be a hobby of theirs. Those flatter indifference curves that came from higher educational attainment likely kept the work week from dropping continuously. So you've got a lot of forces here. Firm resistance, higher marginal income tax rates, and higher education kept, despite rising real wages, the hours of work each week from continuing downward and stabilize them around 40 hours a week. Last point here, you may hear that the average work week in the U.S. is actually around 34 hours. That's true, but the typical work week is still 40 hours. And those two diverge because we have a lot of part-time work that pulls that average down below what the typical work week is.